Thank you, everybody. It's wonderful to see you all here today. For those of you who've done it, you know this, and for those of you who haven't, you should. Writing a book in the humanities and social sciences is no small feat. It is an ultra marathon. It is designed to crush your spirit again and again and again. No, it is. It's really, really hard. So when someone does it, we should celebrate it. And that's ultimately what we're here today to do, is to celebrate a wonderful new book by our colleague and to talk about all the work that went into making it and all the insights that flow from it. But in all seriousness, I mean, writing a book is truly humbling. I know that after I wrote my first book, I said I must atone for all of my sins as a graduate student. When I said in seminar, this book is terrible, or this book is terrible. Anyone who can write a book deserves our respect. It really is true. So our speaker today is Dr. Laura López-Sanders, who's the Robert Stephen Assistant Professor of Sociology here at Brown University. And of course, as many of you know, her work focuses on immigration, inequality, and labor market dynamics. She joined the Brown faculty in 2017, having held previous academic appointments at UNC Chapel Hill, UC Berkeley, and UCSF after receiving her doctorate at Stanford University. López-Sanders has been the recipient of numerous fellowships, including those from the National Science Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the American Sociological Association. And these are testaments to her remarkable scholarship, which has appeared in such journals as Latino Studies, the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and American Behavioral Scientist. Here at Brown, Dr. López-Sanders is a renowned mentor and advisor to undergraduates and graduate students alike. Perhaps some of you know this firsthand, and that is in fact why you are here. Also an award-winning teacher who offers such classes as Race, Immigration, and the Making of Inequality, and next fall's Unstable Times, Migration, Identity, and Societal Imagination. For those of you who are undergraduates, you can pre-enroll next week. Dr. López-Sanders also offers a graduate seminar in ethnographic methods, and it's hard to imagine someone better positioned to guide students in doctoral research in that field based on the remarkable book that we'll be discussing today, The Manufacturing of Job Displacement: How Racial Capitalism Drives Immigrant and Gender Inequality in the Labor Market. I'm not going to spend my time here telling you about all the book's virtues, because those will become obvious to you as we have our discussion today. And of course, Dr. López-Sanders will give an introduction to the book itself. But as someone who comes from a different field, the field of history, where I also think about how difference organizes labor markets, but several hundred years ago, this book was so inspiring to me when I think about what it means to do field work rather than simply going to an archive and thinking oneself as a hero for calling up some boxes and reading dead people's mail from 200 years ago. This book is truly inspiring for what it took to produce. And the kinds of risks and choices that a scholar has to make in pursuing this kind of work, and recognizing the importance of it to the lives that are described and to the kinds of futures that we want to collectively build. So I'm really excited to see you all here today. I'm very, very excited to hear from Laura López-Sanders about the book, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming her to the podium.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. How are you doing today? Good. Yes, very nice, very nice. Thank you very much for coming here in such a rainy day. I really appreciate it. And thank you, CSREA, for the opportunity to discuss my newly released book with you. Thank you, Seth, for a very nice and thoughtful introduction. I also want to express my gratitude to the staff at CSREA for being very accommodating with dates and times to have this talk, and particularly to Stephanie LaRue and to Tricia Ross, who offered me a home when I first joined Brown. So for me, I'm delighted that the first talk on my book is happening here through CSREA and through the coordination of this wonderful team. Thank you. I also am so humbled to see my students here and colleagues from sociology, because they have kept me sane for this past several years. Without you, I don't know where I would be. You know where, drinking tea somewhere. But thank you for coming here today. You are an inspiration, a source of strength to me, and you're here. Thank you. And you're there. You're going to be writing your own books, I know, very shortly. So this is a really important moment to me. As Seth mentioned, it takes a long time to get to this end of the road, but it's also a very rewarding moment. Okay, and I think that is when we reach the end of all the craziness of starting a book project. It is that moment when we send the proofs to the publisher that we realized, number one, all the things we didn't include in the book that we should have included, and number two, is done, and it was a good experience. And that's what I can say about this project and all the rewarding encounters and experiences that I had, not only writing it, but studying the context that are included in the book and the people's lives that I studied. But there's also another important aspect for me in terms of sharing this book with you today, and that the book actually materialized in the intellectual traditions here at Brown. And let me just read something from my notes, and forgive me for reading today because I want to stay within time, and you know me, on that time. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that today. But bringing this book to fruition took many years. Partly because the initial frameworks that I explored for analyzing a job displacement that involved undocumented immigrant workers just didn't fit, okay? The conventional theoretical frameworks that I was working with, they felt inadequate, or they just felt too racially neutral for a process that was clearly very racialized. When I moved to Brown, a significant theoretical shift occurred. My colleague, Jose Itzigson, who is giving a seminar today, shared his deep understanding of Du Boisian sociology with me and introduced me to the Black radical tradition. This insight redirected my research toward the racial capitalism framework. And once I came to this framework, I felt that things started to align. They started to align closely with empirical observations that I was offering in my writing, and it was giving me a tool to have a more nuanced story to understand the intricacies of racialization and displacement. So while the research itself was conducted in the new destination of South Carolina, where I did my field work, the main argument of the book was inspired by the work of colleagues and students here at Brown. So thank you all for having guided me in that direction and for making this also possible. Now, what is this book about? At the heart of work and organizational sociology, there are two critical questions. Why and how do employers transform lower-level jobs into ones nobody wants? And how do employers, purposefully change the racial makeup of the workforce? I wrote this book to tackle these questions and to shift the discourse from simplistic understandings of displacement and immigration to a deeper examination of how racial capitalism orchestrates labor markets to perpetuate inequality and racial division. My primary purpose writing this book was to highlight the need for a more nuanced understanding of how race and other social categories structure economic opportunities and labor market dynamics. I also aim to explore how different stakeholders, like employers, like workers, and even members of communities, co-construct the labor markets under the logic of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism assumes that race is central to the making of profit and gain. As capitalism has its roots in history of colonization, exploitation, and systemic oppression of people of color. I extend some of these ideas to look at the mechanisms that produce displacement and how granular categories, nuanced categories of distinction, pattern the dynamics of hiring and promotion as employers try to expropriate more value from the most vulnerable workers. In this case, in the case of my research, undocumented immigrant workers are the main focus of my study. Undocumented immigrants, as you know, have little legal recourse in the United States and abroad as well, and are subject to employers' oppression and abuse, similar to what we know about the framework of racial capitalism with other groups of workers or individuals. Now, the core argument in the book, particularly its theoretical core, lies in the goal of challenging and redefining the understanding of job displacement, mainly through the lens of a comprehensive case study. HICAP is a pseudonym, a transnational organization that make, and I call it air conditioners, operating with the evolving immigrant landscape of South Carolina. In this factory, I work as a supervisor after having worked as an operator in a series of other jobs that led me to this particular organization. And working as a supervisor in that in-between position between employers and workers, I witnessed the transition of this organization from a black and white composition to a Black Latinx immigrant workplace, a process driven primarily by employers and labor market intermediaries. Traditionally, discussions around immigration have often framed the introduction of immigrant labor as immigrants incorporate in the labor market within the context of the logic of economics, of the cost of immigration arguments. A narrative that, while important, only skims the surface of a much deeper economic and social dynamic. Instead of looking at immigrant economic incorporation in the labor market solely within the cost of immigration literature or lens, in this book, I propose a shift towards examining immigration through the lens of racial capitalism, the logic of exploitation and oppression of undocumented immigrants. This is not merely an economic system, but a profound organization of our economy that is intrinsically aligned along racial lines, designed to leverage racial categorization for financial gain. Through the story of HICAP, this organization where I spent 7 months working as a supervisor, and the broader market dynamics of new immigrant destinations where immigrants are incorporating much more recently than in traditional destinations, the book attempts to peel back the layers of conventional narratives. We examine how racial capitalism not only shapes the structure of our economy, but also how it perpetuates a cycle and disadvantages based on racial categorization. And racial categorization is a key aspect of my argument here. Focusing on racial capitalism, we begin to see displacement or losing one's job in a new light. It's not just about the physical movement of people or the changing demographics of an organization, but it is because employers intentionally tamper with market forces. The system that I'm described in this book talks about the action of employers in particular and how they drive the changes. So the process at HICAP is very complicated, but looking at how they orchestrated the displacement at this company, and this company is only an example of a series of other companies in which I observed a process of racialization in which either employers had already completely changed the demographics of the labor force or were in the process of changing those demographics. But looking at HICAP and their orchestration of displacement illustrates that a racialized displacement is not a simple matter. And employers go to great lengths to create the illusion that they're engaging in simple replacement, meaning that they're filling empty vacancies in the labor market. And much of the explanation, if we think about how jobs are created and fulfilled, it occurs based on theories of segmented labor markets, filling vacancies resulting from high turnover with workers who want to take those jobs. For example, HICAP made every effort to convince employers, convince their supervisors and their workers that that's what they were doing. But in reality, what they were doing is just using other actors, other agencies in the market. They were using bilingual supervisors and temporary employment agencies, some actors who have gained prominence in the way employers displace workers and the way they manage workers without much regulation. But at HICAP, they use agencies to recruit, hire, and train workers using raising, hiring, and displaced workers. And with that, they gain or they distance themselves from the legal liability to be caught implement using race, which is not a legal form of hiring employers in this country, employees. Additionally, the company engaged in a series of experiments based on Taylorism and other lean manufacturing ideals to degrade the jobs and assess the degree to which groups of workers were more exploitable. They transformed the workplace to force native-born Black and white women to quit. And in the meantime, they kept the most vulnerable groups of workers. These were Black men with a criminal record, and these were undocumented Latinx women in precarious work. Furthermore, the book highlights how communities are central stakeholders in racial capitalism, and this is a little bit of a different story, that we don't focus in this book just on the structures of the particular matching between worker and employer, but we also look at what's happening outside the labor market as a process that is linked to racial capitalism. And here I look at how the actions of communities influence the actions of managers. Managers can shift their preferences in response to legal pressures and nativist backlash. The immigrant marches of 2006 and the introduction of E-Verify policies are some of the forces I analyze in the book to explain the weight of the external political and social environment in manufacturing displacement. Here, one of the key contributions in the book is the introduction of the concept of categorical displacement, and it refers to the way employers manufacture a turnover in their organization. This argument that is central to the book refers to the process by which employers, by design, manipulate labor categories using different and nuanced forms of distinction, such as race, gender, and immigration status, to select and hire workers as substitutes rather than complements of established workers. Racial categories like Black, white, Hispanic, and so on are bound up with meaning about the traits of individuals in those categories. Consequently, racialized displacement involves using beliefs about the fitness of individuals in racial categories for a particular job. Racial categories are also bound up with categories of nationality, legal status, and gender, making Latinx workers seem like ideal replacement in the eyes of managers in this particular case. Before concluding, I would like to underscore the fundamental understanding of racial displacement within the labor market from this book. The exploration that I engage in goes beyond the surface, revealing that displacement is not merely about individual actions or simplistic narratives of one group taking jobs from another. Instead, the book indicates that the dynamics of the job market, particularly the role of employers in shaping these dynamics, are at the heart of the issue. This study clearly shows how displacement is manufactured. Employers manipulate the labor market using race, gender, and legal status to segment it and stratify it. This manipulation by employers, not the actions of immigrants, is the primary driver of labor displacement. Such practices are not new. They are rooted deeply in the history of U.S. racial capitalism, where the exploitation of vulnerable workers has been a long-standing characteristic. Empirically, the book tackles what happens after workers are hired and how vacancies are created through employers' direct actions. Much of the processes of displacement we have seen in the sociology of work and organizations tackle the pre-hire stage of the process. It's a lot more difficult to find out what happens after workers are in an organization or a workplace and show what the workings of individuals, human forces, not the market, are doing here. And the book goes in detail into that distinction. Additionally, the book challenges arguments that typically treat categorical groups as dichotomous and homogeneous, and argues that a central characteristic of organizational social relations is that power relations vary based on nuanced divisions. For example, the experience of a Black immigrant woman in the labor market cannot be fully understood by looking solely at racial dynamics, gender discrimination, or immigration status. Each aspect interacts with the others to compound her labor market experience. She may face racial discrimination that is further intensified by gender bias and exacerbated by vulnerabilities associated with her legal status. This intersectionality means that solutions addressing labor market inequalities must be multifaceted and responsive to these overlapping identities and the specific ways in which they interact. Furthermore, recognizing the role of granular categorical distinctions help us understand how employers may exploit these social divisions to their advantage. For instance, by preferring workers from a particular racial or gender group for specific roles, employers can maintain a segmented labor market that reinforces existing inequalities. Similarly, the legal vulnerabilities of immigrant workers can be leveraged to create a more compliant and less costly labor force. This granular categorical lens also illuminates workers' resistance, and there are there's evidence of that in my study as well. Understanding different groups' unique challenges can inspire more effective solidarity and advocacy efforts to transform the labor market into a more equitable space. To conclude, manufacturing displacement under racial capitalism throws into sharp relief precisely how employers deploy racial preferences to turn over the labor force and how workers respond to these actions. It also shows how organizations are embedded in communities and legal systems of racialization that are linked to the degree of vulnerability and oppression of a particular category of workers. As we move forward, let this insight inspire further discussion, research, and reflection on how to address the complexities of the labor market fairly and equitable for all workers. Thank you for your attention and for joining this exploration. Appreciate it.
The conversation that I want to have, I think, is going to start with the things that, frankly, I'm most fascinated about, which are the process of doing this research. And I think, as I alluded to, this may come from my own place outside of the discipline, and so curious about how a project like this gets designed and executed. And from there, we'll move into the theorization of racial capitalism and the intense stuff, and then we'll come back to sort of talking about how a scholar does such amazing work. So let's begin in the beginning with actually some origin stories. There's a wonderful image in this book of a graduate student hopping in the car in California and having a cross-country road trip that is going to bring her to South Carolina. And I'm so curious about that sort of moment, about what you thought you knew, what you did know, and what were the kinds of surprises that you found, and how quickly did they come once you arrived at your destination?
Well, thank you, Seth. One of the, you're right. I mean, I normally start this talking about the book, talking about the field work, and this time I didn't. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to do it. So yes, one day I was sitting in a seminar room. I was still a graduate student, like many of you here, and I started hearing that something was happening in the South, that Latinx people were going there, and that the Latinx community was growing very rapidly and dramatically. And an academic advisor was gearing to start a research project, and that got me thinking about, one, I don't have my dissertation topic yet. 2, I have never been in the South. 3, I'm very interested about what happens at ground zero of immigration, okay? We had seen what happened in places like New York or San Francisco, where an established network of immigrant individuals had already had the networks of support to integrate into society. And so I became very interested in finding out what actually would be like to be at ground zero of immigration. Clearly it wasn't ground zero, but that, in my imagination, that's what I envisioned. And so that semester, and I had not finished yet all my coursework, I still have a couple of classes, but I just didn't want to miss the opportunity. So I did everything to wrap up my semester, which was like about 2 months before it was over. And that summer, I submitted my IRB, as you know about, and went and just said, I'm just going to drive there. I didn't know what I was doing. And please know that this is not the traditional way immigrants typically go into a place. You usually would know somebody there, or when you're doing research that is ethnographic, you also will have, some contacts there before you move there. That wasn't the case. I really wanted to know what was going on before the growth of the Latinx community expanded. And so I drove actually at the time of Katrina. I don't know if anybody remembers Hurricane Katrina. And I was in the caravans of people looking for hotels, and that's when I first started hearing about how African Americans in particular were having a really hard time finding jobs if they move from the Louisiana area up towards more of South Carolina, North Carolina, and look for hotels that were available at the time. That this is too much detail, but what I found is by talking to them is that we cannot find hotels and we cannot find work. And one of the things that surprised me after I made the trek and crossed the country in a place that I've never been was to find how my experience was not the same as the experience of the people I was caravanning with, essentially. That story of, it's really hard to find jobs for us was not the experience that I had when I got there. And one of the things that I found is that, first of all, is like, what do I do? Okay, I get there, I had a small white sedan, all with things on top, and everything was coming out of the trunk. Not really, but it was, my belongings were all there. And I started walking through some of the neighborhoods, and one of the things that I noticed in a place that was one of these new immigrant destinations was that it was a very different context in the sense of what I was familiar with respect to immigrant integration in places like California and so forth. And that was that immigrants were dispersed. They were not densely concentrated in some areas. So it wasn't necessarily the Latinx neighborhood, okay, or the places that where you could identify people. And even in the book, I have a vignette of a recruiter that is driving across the city around different apartment buildings because she couldn't find Hispanic workers, okay, rather than going into a neighborhood, which would be something that a recruiter would do in a place like California. And I don't mean to stereotype, but this is sort of the landscape that I was starting to see. And so the other thing that surprised me is that it was the degree of urbanization that an immigrant who spent most of her adult life, which was my case, in a place like California that is very urban, very densely concentrated, and going into a place like South Carolina that things were not in that way, you could not really easily walk into, run into somebody and ask them, where do I go and find a place to live? And so the first place that looked like it would be a place where I could find that information was a place, and I talk about that in my method section in the book, a place called Taco Casa. And I'm saying, this is where I'm gonna know where I'm gonna find an apartment. And Taco Casa turned out to be owned by a white entrepreneur that fell in love with Mexican food on a trip in Baja, a fishing trip at Baja. And so, the tacos were hard shells, and it was like being in Taco Bell, but with a name like Taco Casa. So the workers were black workers, and the cashiers were white individuals. No Latinos there. And it's like, this is not what I know, because in California I will go to a Mexican place or a place that was labeled as Taco Casa, and I will talk to people that look like me. And so that was one of the surprises, and I said, where am I going? And I drove around until, and I talk about this in the book, and I saw a Taco Casa, and one of the workers there saw me looking at maps, because at the time, we're all fortunate now that GPS and stuff like that, and I talk about that too. I didn't have a cell phone with the kinds of modernities that we had. And so I was with maps all over the table, and the workers say, where are you going? And I'm like, well, I don't know. And she's like, well, what are you looking for? And I say, well, I'm looking for a place where I can live. He's like, what? And so at the end of that conversation, what I found is that Latinos live in the quote-unquote trashy part of town, okay? And so there were already those ideas of where the Latino community was concentrated being shared within that environment. And so I ended up going to the place that later on I did learn that it was called quote-unquote Little Mexico, but it was about 2 streets, okay? One of them I call in the book Pioneer Road, as you might imagine why, because they were the pioneers. And surprisingly, what I found, and this is relevant to your story or your research, is that the Latino population wasn't the way I have learned that it was moving there. That it wasn't just as new as I thought it was, okay? That clearly at the time, we were starting to learn from census data that yes, there was this growth, but there was this underlying story, as you always discover when you're doing field work and ethnographic research, and that is that there was a pioneer group that arrived there from Rhode Island and from Massachusetts and from Long Island, and that were the first one to start bringing in and recruiting the cohorts of immigrants that were there when I started doing my research. And so that migration, which we call secondary migration, right, from North Carolina, from Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Long Island, ended up creating what was that known, Little Mexico. Anyway, so that's the beginning of the story.
Yeah, that's a very good beginning. But in terms of the design of the project, I mean, one of the remarkable things about the book is that you have multiple positions, and you are, from your own fieldwork, seeing this process of manufacturing job displacement from different areas of the shop floor. And when did it come, when did the design structure of the project come into focus? I mean, when you wrote up a dissertation prospectus, was it all clear that first I will do this and then I will do this, or did this evolve more organically once you were on the ground?
I had an idea that I wanted to study immigrant integration, okay? And so my proposal for IRB purposes was that, you know, I was going to look at churches, and I was going to spend my time in schools and in community centers and so forth. But I didn't want to study just immigrant incorporation. I've always been very interested in race and ethnic relations, especially because part of my question when I wrote my proposal before going there was about the process of transition from a two-group racial system into a three-group racial system. I was very interested in how, when Latinx immigrants move to a place like South Carolina, how the color line shifts. So somewhere in my mind, I already had some Du Boisian thinking that had not yet gelled. But I think that what I wrote was, I want to see how it is that incorporation happened. And it wasn't until I got there, and this is part of the ethnographic trajectory of the project, is that I discovered that maybe the most productive route for the book, or the project at the time, wasn't a book, was going to be to look at where Latinx individuals, African Americans, and white people actually interact. If I wanted to look at how the color line evolved, I needed to be where they interacted. And it wasn't churches, because as many of you know, Sunday at 10 a.m. is one of the most segregated times in many parts of the country still, right? That Spanish-speaking individuals went to Spanish-speaking mass, even in the same church where English-speaking individuals went to mass, but white individuals. But the linguistic aspect then created that division. And so I decided that those were not going to be productive ways to do it. And so I started looking at the labor market as the place where people actually were getting into interactions. And my first job, in order to understand those processes, and I talk about it in the book, was cleaning toilets, right? And so I started, as many people without any experience start. One of my neighbors connected me with her networks, and then she said, you know, you want a job? And like, you know, do I need a job? Well, if you want to understand the dynamics, how immigrants actually incorporate, well, not in those terms, but you know, if you want to know how immigrants get along with other people, you need to be in workplaces. And so she recommended or referred me to her contractors, and I started working cleaning toilets. From there, I started working in jobs as operator. And as you might imagine, I was a PhD student, and I have no clue on how to actually operate anything that was mechanically related, okay? And so I did have the experience that I ended up with a third-degree burn in my arm, which, you know, these kinds of things tend to happen during field work, but don't go and do that, okay? Not to everybody. But you know, and part of it was that inadequacy, and that just also tells you about how skills really don't matter, right? It really, I mean, it's like these are going to be the people that are going to do these jobs, and we're going to hire them, right? And so the design evolved into being a worker in operation positions as an operator, and then into moving into a supervisory position. And what I did was realize that if I wanted to understand the relationship of employers with workers, that I needed to be in an in-between position, okay, as a supervisor, or in a way in which employers were going to trust me, because I had gained the trust of workers as an operator, but I had employers would not necessarily talk to me that much. And so I started getting myself into ways in which I could position myself at that level of the labor market. And the job at High Cap was when I get to that point. Now, I emphasize another aspect of the design here, and that is that I believe the labor market, I'm convinced that organizations, employment, workplaces are connected with communities, and I also, as I move in the kinds of jobs that I was having, I also move into neighborhoods that went along with the roles that I was playing. So for the first part of my research, I live in a neighborhood where most Latinos arrived, where we have about 7 armed robberies within a couple of months, and an 80-year-old person, white lady, actually lived 3 doors from mine that was the drug dealer of the neighborhood, and so that was the neighborhood where I arrived for the first time. And then as I move into a supervisory position, I also changed my employment, my living situation, and moved into a neighborhood that was more working class, where supervisors also live, in order to tap into their experiences and being able to interview them as well.
No, that's really interesting, because you couldn't sit in California and design a project where and then I'll become a supervisor in a manufacturing plant. That would not be something you could just will yourself to do, although you made that happen. But one of the things that didn't seem to go away in your study was the interest in sort of immigrant integration and the way in which communities form. And as you and I have talked previously, this way in which there is life beyond the shop floor. And can you speak for a little bit about the ways in which the sort of the off hours time of your field work also helped you understand the subjectivities and realities of the people you were both working alongside and then ultimately supervising?
I was very fortunate, actually, because I had neighbors that essentially adopted me, and they were just really giving. So part of the way people socialize in the neighborhoods, the places, the apartments where we lived were just not very inhabitable, okay? In the sense of the conditions were not something that were the most conducive to be socializing indoors. So socializing happened in parks, and so we spent a lot of time in either parks or parking lots, okay? And so, I was able to go to picnics in parks with some of the people that I work with, and I also was neighbor with. I also was invited to some of their, kids' birthday parties. I went to church with many of them. I actually volunteered in a child care center at the local Catholic church, and that allowed me to also develop stronger ties to some of with some members of the community, particularly with the pioneers of the community who were the leaders of some of the church. And so I did the kind of activity, or engage in the kinds of activities, that we engage when we are doing field work. A lot of my interactions happen by the nature of my own characteristics and background with Spanish-speaking Latinx people. But when I moved into the working class neighborhood, I moved the house that I was renting, I had a white neighbor on one side and a black neighbor on the other side, and I was able to develop relationships with people, with my neighbors as well. And people were so giving. I mean, at some point they will take care of my plants, and they will, and I will bring them, apricots and things like that. I mean, it was just the kind of fellowship that you would expect, and acceptance that you would expect of people that are kind and thoughtful. Mm-hmm.
No, terrific. So let's move to the argument of the book, and start with this premise that the initial idea is that we have sort of bifurcated racial systems of black and white that become tripartite with the arrival of new immigrants from Latin America. But one of the things that your book is so clear about is that those categories have to be disaggregated, that the category of black or the category of Latinx or even the category of white is actually not so useful in understanding the kinds of decisions that employers are making. So can you say a little bit more about the sort of ways in which employers came to slice and dice the labor pool in ever more fine gradations in which racial categories are just sort of the beginning, but certainly not the end of who is desirable for what kind of work and who is undesirable for other kinds of work?
Thank you for that question. You know, it took a while for me to actually disentangle that aspect of the research because my first inclination was that the preference was widespread for Latinx individuals, right? That they wanted them because primarily the vast majority of the people that I studied were undocumented immigrants, and they were the ones that employment agencies were hiring, and it was the largest labor pool in the area. And what I found is that employers actually didn't just want Latinx individuals, okay? To start at a place like HICAP, they wanted what they call heavy lifters, okay? That was the euphemism they used to refer to Hispanic men, and in part it's because they wanted people that could lift heavy pieces, okay? They didn't want to deal essentially with women. And so I started realizing that they wanted people that were very vulnerable in the sense of if they wanted to control them, they would not be complaining, and they were much more exploitable in essence. But when they started having trouble bringing in those workers, employers themselves ended up readjusting their own queuing or their own ranking of the workers, okay? Because after all, their main goal is to get the work done and get the work done with the most vulnerable workers. And so when the available pool of workers turned out to be Latinx women, okay, and they were still controllable, and they were and in part is because of the undocumented status, they let go the idea that they were not going to get the men because and this is part of the story of how the organization, how plants, how companies are also embedded in the market, right? That there were the men had alternatives, okay? The Latinx workers could go into construction. That was a gender type of work for women. So Latinx women were not at the time, I did a follow-up study, and they were starting to get into construction. But at the first phase of my study, Latinx women didn't have construction as an alternative for them. And so at that point, that nuance and the granularity of the categories really is tied to the way it's going to play in the degree of control that the employer has or can have, and also the alternatives that are available to the workers, and whether they have even the possibility to exit an organization. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I mean, this is precisely why the work so resonated with my historical scholarship. Mm-hmm. So, right, writing about Baltimore in the 18 teens and the kinds of choices that manufacturers are making among a workforce that isn't just black or white or enslaved and free, but looking at, say, different enslaved workers and saying, well, our first preference is, of course, fugitives from the countryside who've come to the city because they have the least recourse. But perhaps a close second would be someone who is in the process of self-purchase, and recognizing that person has every incentive to continue to work and to work efficiently and so forth. But also at the same time, what about someone who I can purchase for life and thus possibly resell after a couple of years with an increased value after I've trained them to do a certain job? And the ways in which employers are juggling make it very difficult to come to some easy conclusion that it's just oh, we prefer enslaved workers over free workers. So what you're seeing there really, speaks to me as a much longer historical process. But what also comes clear in this is that, we cede way too much ground when we attribute these processes to something called the market, right? That the market is a very slippery space and one that is in many ways a euphemism. And what your book makes so clear is that it's a euphemism for employer decision-making to seek the cheapest labor, defining cheapness as vulnerability, as lack of legal recourse, as being closed off from other avenues, but also having limited capacity to use the state and the state's power to combat bad conditions or non-paid wages or whatever it might be. So I guess what I want to say is or what I want to hear you talk more about then is if we shift the focus to an active set of decisions by employers to manufacture job displacement, if we jettison the idea that this is just the inevitable outcome of market forces or the inevitable thing that just happens mysteriously when immigrants come, what are the implications then of recognizing employers as, I guess, functionally bad actors? And how does our recognition of them as bad actors intersect with the incentives that employers simultaneously have to appear not racist and to comply with laws that prevent them from using race as a basis for employment decisions?
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question correctly, but let me give it a try. I think that the implications are that it really depends on the angle that we look at how the employers are seen in the manufacturing of demographic shift in an organization, okay? And what I'm thinking is that if you imagine that the employer is going to put themselves out there and risk the reputation of their companies or risk their own, financial future, I don't think that's what's happening here, okay? And I didn't see that. And in fact, in one of the organizations that I work, it was a mill, the owner is somebody who has a huge reputation of being somebody who is very much anti-unions, anti-employer protection, and so forth. And he, when he was hiring immigrant workers, he was strictly careful on selecting people that had the documentation that would pass muster, okay? And that could be documentation that was not necessarily the best documentation, but when run through a system of E-Verify or so forth, they were not going to get in trouble, okay? As we know, immigrant hiring happens within an industry as well, and scholars call this the immigration industry because there is a whole business entrepreneurship system that plays into this kind of preference that employers have that manufacture documents and so forth. There's a gray market for this. But what I find is, and to your question in terms of how this happens is related to the implications. I have a couple of chapters where I go at length on the ways employers are not going to put themselves there and risk their reputation, okay? They're going to use others, including bilingual supervisors, including temporary employment agencies, to get out of that, okay? And to me, one of the key things that is happening is that having with the shift of hiring not being directly done through a company, but through a temporary employment agency, you end up removing the possibility of actually detecting some of these discriminatory practices. And so the implications are, in my view, that the more creative employers get in manufacturing a displacement, the harder it is for us to enforce EOC compliance, okay? And so I think that we need to go beyond the industrial relationship the way we know it, which is employer-worker. It is way more complex, and it is not only happening in the organizations. More and more we see workers in general being subcontracted, right? And the subcontracting is creating layers and layers of obscurity to really make employers responsible for being liable and ethical and humanitarian, and have look at immigrants as human beings, right?
It's another example of outsourcing.
Yes.
They
Yes.
outsource the dirty work of discriminating, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about the analytic frame of racial capitalism and what that does for your study. I mean, one of the things that the theorization of racial capitalism does, coming from Cedric Robinson and mediated through people like Robin Kelly, is to focus our attention on how the categories of difference that are operative are not in fact stable, but they're constantly changing. And one of the great examples of this I always find is looking at the scientific management literature from the early 20th century, in which, for example, you might have a chart for a plant in Pittsburgh in which managers are discriminating between Finns and Swedes and Norwegians because Finns are very good at night work under humid conditions, but Norwegians are very good at day labor, but not with things that are heavy. And to us, this is not comprehensible. These are just a bunch of white people, right? And it suggests that in the future, right, the categories of difference that operate under racial capitalism will also be different. So what was your experience from this research, and what do you find about sort of the slipperiness of racial categories, or the shifting terrain of racial categories that might be operative in 2010, but that might be diminishing by 2020, and that might in fact be illegible to us in 2030? Do you see some of that process in your research?
Oh, that's a great question, and I'm terrible with my what's the name of this balls where you predict the future, but I'll give it a try.
Your crystal ball,
my
yes.
crystal ball, thank you. So one of just based on my own the research that I was doing at the time, and I think this idea of the shifting categories was so puzzling to me, and in a way so idiosyncratic as well, right? In the sense of, for example, women, in the way we understand gender in sociology, right? At some point it became being pregnant and not being pregnant, right? Where employers were making decisions in terms of whether they wanted to hire pregnant women or not pregnant women, because they needed to provide accommodations for pregnant women, okay? And so they ended up, informally asking supervisors informally to whether they knew if any of the new hires were pregnant, or if somebody fell sick, one of the first questions would be, is she pregnant? And so, those categories that are just so absurd and have nothing to do in a way with what you would expect will change somebody's ability to hold a job, were being deployed and managed and tinkered with, right? And so these are the kinds of ways in which I think we can think about how unstable and how difficult it is for employers to manage their social identities when they can be part of a process of deselection of the labor market, right? Another thing in terms of, what makes somebody I talk about this in the book in terms of the notion of a hard worker, right? Also ties to the notions of categorization. And in part is because they connect social identities to this ethos of working hard, right? And we've seen this in the organizational literature with the Disney factory, right? In terms of workers that are expected to smile all the time and to be happy and excited, right? This was one of the attributes that employers attach to Latinx women. You know, they're always smiling and enthusiastic and happy, and so they're very good workers. You know, they don't have an attitude. And so these kinds of things that we don't necessarily associate with race, that we don't associate with the sort of bounded categories that we understand as creating distinctions, were emerging in that process of selection. Clearly nothing of that was formalized, right? I mean, it was more about this general sense that that contributed to employers developing their mental maps about who is a good worker, right, and goes into that equation.
Right. And one of the things your book also makes clear, though, is that this racial knowledge is not merely being produced by employers, but it's also being produced by intermediaries, functionally ethnic entrepreneurs, right, who have their own sense of why Quechua speakers are better than Spanish speakers or this and that. So can you talk a little bit about how we make sense of that group of people within this ecosystem and the particular ways in which sort of the particular agenda and hierarchies that these intermediaries have are shaping the larger categories of race that organize labor in a place like South Carolina?
Yes, and I this was something that to me, I mean, this is not a new finding, as we know, but it is something that to me was very ubiquitous in this particular context, okay? We know ethnic entrepreneurs are part of the immigration story, right? But what happened in the case of manufacturing displacement is that the way employers ended up having an idea of the kind of worker that makes the good worker, it was not necessarily only through their social networks, by going into their conferences, into, you know, reading the literature, the cultural artifacts in which they share information, the newsletter of the Best Business Bureau, whatever it is. It was also through what I call in the book the market makers, right? The pioneers, the Colombian pioneers that I mentioned earlier on in the conversation that we're having, were the ones who arrived there and being positioned at a place where mobility ladders are so scarce, they also look for ways to advance into a middle class status, right? And so what happens is they look for opportunities, and what is their capital, right? Their capital is ethnic capital. They can deploy their knowledge of people that are co-ethnics and sell it to the employer, okay? And what they did is, and I have some interviews with some of these market makers in the book, is essentially start the first employment agencies. They were the staff of the first employment agencies positioned in places like Pioneer Road, right? The places where immigrants arrived. And they were the ones who would come into the organizations, translate the manuals from English to Spanish, being there on the phone, and they offer their personal phone number and say, you know, call me anytime if you have a worker that doesn't understand this. They made themselves so available to employers so that the labor force was easily introduced and they could not have to deal with the cultural integration of the workers. And so these are fundamental elements of a process of that neutral, deracialized market process in an ironic, I mean, I'm being sarcastic here, but it is very much a way in which, depending on the position of people in the racial hierarchy, is also what they're going to do in this kind of marketization of social relations, right?